Great. Welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs on this lovely Wednesday, February 22nd. For the second half of our morning here, we're going to be renewing our conversation about our draft elections bill. And John Rogers is here, former senator, and welcome to the House Gov.Ops Committee. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee, for giving me a little time to speak on this. It's actually a subject that former Senator White and myself spoke about several times, and we're planning on getting to at some point, but neither of us are there anymore. And so I was quite pleased to see that your committee was taking it up. It's been my perspective for a long time that one person, one vote, and one candidate, one party. And personally, even beyond what's in your bill, I think we have a serious problem with primary elections, because even in a good year like last year, 27% of the electorate came out in the primary. And by having these hybrid candidates that are representing two different parties, it skews the results even further. If the progressives want to be a party, then I think if you're a progressive, you should run as a progressive and not as a Democrat. And so, I mean, no disrespect to any candidates, but I'd like to use a couple of the elections as an example. And Dave Zuckerman's a friend of mine. I've worked with him for years, from the time I was elected into the House back in 2003. But the fact that he continues to run as a DP, I don't believe there's any such thing as a Democratic progressive. You're either a Democrat or a progressive. You wouldn't consider yourself to be a Democratic Republican or a Republican progressive. And I believe the race would have gone much different if Dave would have run as a progressive. It would have been a three-way race in the general. But what happened, because Dave got the nomination, other people who've run as Democrats their whole life got beat, because the progressives are voting in the Democratic election, in the Democratic primary. And it's my perspective, and I don't know how to solve it, but maybe this committee does. I think the primaries, as we run them in this state and in the nation, are part of what is causing the conflict, mostly in Washington, more so than here in the State House. But out of that 27%, which is higher than it is very often, you're getting your most partisan people. You're getting the folks on the left and the folks on the right. And that's why we're seeing many of these primary elections, moderates can't make it through. Moderates who would beat the candidate that beat them if it went to a general election. And I would go back to the lieutenant governor's race. I believe if Kitty Toll and Dave Zuckerman were running in the general election, I believe Kitty Toll would have beat him. I believe in the race for Congress. If Becca Balint and Molly Gray ran against each other in the general election, I believe Molly Gray would have won. That's just my perspective. I mean, you could ask political scientists who study this more. But what's happening in our elections is it's not just Democrats voting in the Democratic primary. And I think your bill addresses this by making people pick a party. You're either one or the other. I was listening to a VPR broadcast, and they were interviewing the leader of the Vermont Progressive Party, and he said that some 20 of their folks, progressives, were running as Democrats for the legislature. So is there a progressive party or is there not? So I'm very thankful that you're talking about this issue, and I really hope you're able to advance it. Another thing that I believe in strongly is that independents should be able to file after the primary. In a case like this year's election, primary election, maybe, and of course, Kitty Toll didn't do it, and I don't think you're able to do it now. But it would have given her or another person the opportunity to run for the lieutenant governor's position, because maybe they supported Kitty and they weren't happy with the choices of Joe Benning and Dave Zuckerman. And I think it's super important for people to have choice. And if nobody makes it through the primary who they can support, then there is still an opportunity to be independent. And so I would hope that independents aren't held to having to file previous to the primary, because I think that's one of the reasons to be an independent, is that you can step into the race at any point if the candidates are not satisfactory to you and a group of Vermonters. Yeah, I guess that really covers my main concerns are the independents being able to get in the race at any point and making candidates pick the party that they're going to run with and run in that primary. And I think those are my two main concerns.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We've heard a variety of perspectives. I'm sure you watched some of the testimony we took on this last week, and it really runs the gamut. And it's great to have I think you bring a different perspective than some of the ones we've heard, so I appreciate that. So I have Representative Hooper and then Representative Hooper.
Senator, welcome.
Thank you.
Don't you think we would sooner get rid of the primary process than allow independents to lose and then run nonetheless? I mean, wouldn't it defeat the point?
Well, and that has been an argument, the second bite at the apple, so to speak. But are we in the business of restricting candidates, or do we want people to have a choice? And from my perspective, a progressive won our Democratic race for lieutenant governor. And as I said, Dave's a friend of mine, but he's a progressive. He's always been a progressive. He's not a Democrat. And so why should we allow him to move forward as a Democrat without the opportunity for at least somebody that is a real Democrat to be able to run as an independent? That's my perspective, the way the system is set up right now. And even if we change the system and you only ran on one, like last year, I think there were 4 candidates for lieutenant governor, and say your candidate didn't make it through and you weren't happy with who was left there for the general election. I still think that it's and we all know it's extremely hard for an independent to win in Vermont, but I think it's still important if somebody has something to say that the other candidates aren't going to bring up, that the independents are allowed to run after the primary, after they know who's going forward for the major parties.
Representative Hooper, and I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Everybody here has heard this story, but I'll tell you the story for your folklore collection. On election day, 2 JPs go out to a man's house who recently had his leg cut off, and he was concerned with that rather than the election. And when we got there and asked him which ballot he wanted a progressive ballot. He'd been a progressive for a long time. He looked at the ballot, turned it over a couple of times, says, "I don't recognize anybody on this ballot." And I said, "Oh, you want the Democrats' ballot. Why would I want that? It's where all your candidates are." So it's confusing to the electorate also.
It is confusing. Yes. And I would say on that same point I've heard talk of ranked choice voting, which I think is extremely confusing. And it is not as cut and dried as ranked choice supporters say it is, because say my first choice doesn't win and the election moves on to the second choice and somebody I really don't like ends up winning. Well, maybe my 5th choice would have been my second choice if I knew that other person was going to win. I stand by one person, one vote. As you said, most people don't understand. Those of us who work in this building for years kind of build a knowledge of the science of voting, but most people don't understand. And quite frankly, in some races, the Democratic primary is the general election. I mean, basically, we've seen that in a bunch of races recently. And unfortunately, 27% is a high percentage for a primary election. And it's despicable that less than a third of the electorate gets to pick. And it's unfortunate. I don't know how you convince more people of the importance of the primary election, but we haven't been able to do it. In some years, you know, the results, I think the turnout's down in the teens, which is really horrible. And so is it really giving us a slate of candidates that the general electorate really wants? And I think often it doesn't. And I think the primary system is part of what is leading to extremes, as I said, more in national politics than in statewide. But in statewide politics, there are certain pockets that are progressive or conservative. And all too often, the moderate gets taken out by a small percentage of the electorate in a primary, when that moderate would have likely won if they made it to the general.
Just a couple more questions, because we have another witness waiting and we've got to get a new draft on the table in order to provide some context for that. So just framing up here. So Representative Higley, you're next.
John, thanks for coming down. I agree with you that I think folks ought to be able to run after the primary as an independent. One example that I can give for sure, you may remember, this latest Republican primary for the U.S. House. There was an individual that was nominated that said they wouldn't even caucus with Republicans. There was maybe you saw some conversation here about the possibility of somehow the party putting out a statement. Well, they can do that anyway, I guess. But again, maybe something on the ballot that they're not supported by the party. Is that anything that you would?
Well, absolutely. If you have a candidate that's not going to support the party, why would the party support them? But I think that's another one of the problems. And one time in my Senate race, I actually got the Republican and the Democratic nomination. And selfishly, I took the Republican nomination because I knew it eliminated the possibility of the party appointing someone, and I did it for my own self-preservation. It was the best thing for my chances for the election to not have to run against a Republican. But in hindsight, that's one of the reasons I support the one candidate, one party, is because the local party should have the ability to put a candidate forward if no one got nominated for their party and they find a viable candidate.
If I can just comment on that, that's something else that I've mentioned, and both Mike Marcotte and myself, because there was no Democrat running against us, got the RD nomination. Mm-hmm. I never gave it a thought other than, I think you would agree with this possibly, that most of the Democrats up our way aren't necessarily involved in the Democratic Party. They just consider themselves Democrats. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about that is maybe the Democrats that did vote for me as Democrats appreciated seeing that there was a certain number of Democratic votes that got me on the ballot as a Democrat as well. So I have mixed feelings about that.
As do I, Representative Higley, because you feel, when you get that many write-in votes, you do feel some gratification that, okay, there's a bunch of people who are voting on that other ticket that supported me. And that's one of the reasons I said, yeah, I'll take the R endorsement. But in hindsight, I really feel that the electorate needs as much, as deep a field to choose from as they possibly can. And by taking those nominations, we are eliminating the possibility of the county party putting together a slate of their own people.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to Representative Byron and then Representative Murwicki, and then we've got to move on. You brought some great things to the table, John. Thank you.
I think I have a quick question for you, but I just wanted to ask you this. I've asked other witnesses this question, but I want to tap it into your years and decades of experience in this elections world and service. Are you aware of, or how many or any hybrid candidates who are PRs or RPs?
No, that's one that we haven't seen. Yeah.
Representative Murwicki.
Thanks, John, for coming, but I did want to just offer Mark the reminder that Democrats are holding a place in our caucus for you.
Nice.
John being in the house, it's refreshing to hear, we're never at odds to figure out what you think about something.
That's true.
The question of party registration keeps coming up. What do you think about that?
I've never been a fan of party registration because there again, that eliminates the ability for independents and people who don't declare a party to vote in a electorate. And I think it's our responsibility to try to get as many people as possible to the polls. And I'm so frustrated, as I've mentioned, with the low turnout that we get in primaries. And so I think party registration flies in the face of one person, one vote. Every person should get a vote in the primary, no matter what their party affiliation is.
Yeah. And just for the record, our town was over 50% in the last primary, but that's still not.
That's great, really, for a primary. And right, it's still not enough.
It's still
Yep.
not good enough.
Yeah.
Hey, John, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And I know, committee, the way I would like to use our time this morning is that I'd like to invite Will Senning from the Elections Division to introduce the idea to us of the electronic return of ballots. And then I'd like to let Mr. Harlan Smith, who's joining us remotely, talk about that particular aspect. And then I'll have Legislative Council walk us through the new draft 2.7 that includes both that new language about ballot returns and the proposal that I would like to make as a potential compromise on the fusion candidates issue. So that's just the order of operations. So I'd like to invite Will to take the seat if you're ready to tee up the conversation about ballot returns.
Happy to, Chair McCarthy. Thanks for having me. I don't have, because we're still, working on various edits to the current draft, I don't have a printed copy in front of me. So excuse my use of my laptop if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, please. I'm all about the electronics and eschewing paper.
Okay. You want me to start with and focus on electronic return, which I'm happy to do.
Just so that we can use Mr. Smith's time, I want to just put a box around. Let's talk about that first.
Sure.
Get the committee familiar with that issue, and then we'll open it up and talk about the rest of the changes in the new draft.
Great. So thankfully I prepared some notes specifically on this subject for y'all.
Great.
Something I've worked on for a long time during my tenure as the elections director at the Secretary of State's office, which for the record, this is Will Senning, Director of Elections. When we discuss the issue of electronic return of ballots, I think actually I don't have this in my notes, but I want to make really clear from the top an important distinction between what we're discussing here and the concept of online voting. It's a little hard to distinguish in your head, but the nature of, you hear people talk about the concept of online voting, it's casting your votes via the internet or via electronically, sort of having your ballot go directly from you into the results of the election via the internet, casting your individual votes, making your choices individually via an electronic means. Whereas the notion, the concept of electronic ballot return has been around for a long time, precedes any of the technology that people are referring to when they talk about online voting, and can encompass any range of means of returning a ballot electronically. Those have obviously developed over time. The first states to allow and implement electronic return of ballots, some of the common ways were by fax machine, for instance. and probably the most common, a PDF attached to an email. So a voter prints, marks a ballot, somehow scans that ballot, creates a PDF of it, and attaches it to an email to send back to their local jurisdiction. As such, right, the debate surrounding the electronic return of ballots has always been a balancing of security, keeping the voters' votes secure and free of manipulation, versus increasing voter access, making it easier for people to return their voted ballots to their local jurisdiction, particularly military and overseas voters, which I know is the purview of this committee, and voters with disabilities is where it can have the most significant impact in terms of increasing access. So it's always been a balance between those two things, making sure we can leverage this technology to make it easier and in fact possible for a lot of people to vote, while trying to make sure we protect the security of those ballots that are coming back. That's your basic balance. I would say that for a long time, for years, the security arguments were kind of winning the day and keeping a lot of this policy from moving forward for legitimate reasons, right? To make sure we can get it right and to make sure there's no manipulation of ballots happening as they're coming back. More and more over the last couple of years, in my experience, the pendulum has been swinging the other way toward this being really, again, the only means to facilitate the return of ballots for a pretty significant number of otherwise qualified registered voters who are either active duty military, even in the States. Easier, I would acknowledge, for those folks to get a ballot back by mail, but military voters who are overseas, U.S. citizens living overseas, and again, voters with disabilities. And really, it's that providing an accessible means for an early return of ballots by voters with disabilities that's really swinging the pendulum. There are multiple states, I can provide lists of these if the committee so desires, that have already been sued over their inability to provide a sufficient accessible means for voters with disabilities to return their ballots during the early voting period, including our neighbors. I believe both New Hampshire and Massachusetts have faced such lawsuits. And in response to such lawsuits are either in the process of or already have implemented a system like we're going to talk about for returning early ballots from voters with disabilities and military voters. I think that if we don't take this step, it is not
Just a clarifying question.
go for it.
When you're finished.
If we don't take this step, I think we can expect either lawsuit or threat of lawsuit in the not too near future about our lack of an option for electronic return for voters with disabilities.
What would the mechanics of it be, Will? Are we going to my voter page?
We'll get to that.
Go in and get it, and I
Getting
get
right there.
emails from Harbor Freight all the time from somebody else, you know, like.
That is what we're going to go. So just to level set, right, to let you know where we are, as is the case in many states, right now we allow electronic delivery of these ballots only to a subset, the same subset that we're going to talk about allowing return to. We allowed the delivery electronically to, I have to stop myself every time I say UOCAVA voters because that's the federal law that applies these requirements. UOCAVA voters are military voters and civilians living overseas. So UOCAVA voters and voters with disabilities now can get their ballot delivered electronically. We're talking about also allowing just those same subsets of voters to return it electronically. I have in my notes here that the electronic delivery has been a great success. I really can't characterize it any other way. The only reason that I haven't argued to expand it to all voters, which a number of states actually at this point allow, is that it does, at the point we're at with our technology right now, would require a lot of duplication of ballots that wouldn't be able to be read by the tabulators when they come back via this electronic return. I'll get to that in a second also. This language proposes the same subsets of voters to return it. So currently, as I said, you can receive it, and you receive it through your My Voter page, as Representative Hooper was referring to. So what's important to note and remember about that page is that you log into that page with some personally identifying information takes your first name, your last name, of course, your town of residence, then either your driver's license number or the last four of your social security number to access your My Voter page in the first place. Started by putting a PDF of the ballot and a printable version of the certificate that needs to go on the envelope with the ballot on the voter's My Voter page. So they could download that PDF, mark it by hand, download the certificate, sign it, put that certificate on an envelope, put the ballot in it, and mail it back to the clerk. We took another step forward recently by implementing an online ballot marking device. I talked about that a little bit with you guys when we did our run through, and I was kind of setting the table for this, right? That is essentially the exact same interface that voters get at the polls with the accessible voting system. But you log into the My Voter page, and if you've requested your ballot electronically, you get actually an intermediate page before you come to the My Voter page, and it says access my ballot or go to My Voter page. If you use the access my ballot, you go to this online ballot marking interface. It's a separate software company that offers it. It's called Democracy Live. I can talk with you guys more about Democracy Live at length, or feel free to look them up. Leading provider of this service really around the country. The online interface, you know, it's cool, and you can think about it. And again, if you've ever gone in, you should. I'd encourage you to at the next election. Go ahead and use the accessible voting system at your polling place. Anybody can use it. You go through the screen and you can mark your choices like you would mark on a ballot. You say print, and it prints out with the ovals filled in. It inks the ovals right there for you. We spend weeks in our office testing the ballots and making sure it's dropping the ink in the right place on the ovals from what you've marked, and that it's well aimed at the ballot itself. So the concept with the online ballot is the same thing. You say access my ballot, you use that option. Again, we have to back end the whole thing, so it makes sure to show you the right ballot right out of the 275 ballot styles that I've talked about. You go through on screen, mark that ballot. This is in the early voting context at home, right? You've said, I want my ballot electronically from the clerk. You're sitting at your desk at home. Mark your choices, print it out. Again, package it up. From that interface, we also print the certificate language that you need to put on the outside of the envelope. Takes two envelopes like it would. We don't send you envelopes, obviously, when you're doing electronic delivery. So you got to find your own envelopes, put the certificate on one of them that has your ballot in it, and then put it in a return mailer to go back to the clerk. That's sort of the means that we're talking about, right? So the difference here is you'll follow the same flow. The voter will request it electronically, right, from those two subsets I talked about. You'd be able to access it and use the ballot marking tool. You'd still be able to go in and do the PDF, print it, mark it, and mail it back if that's what you prefer and it's doable. But this option would essentially allow you to do the exact same process, make your choices, and instead of the button saying print, the button says submit to clerk. And the ballot gets delivered back through this portal, does touch the internet at that point, I have to fully acknowledge, right? Via the servers that this company administers. You will have the ability to, I'm going to get to, this is the lowest level of detail I'll get to with about the process. I think what we have to do is have the ability for you to either do the kind of checkbox electronic signature to submit the certificate, or the technology is advanced to the point, I really like it, I was looking at it about a month ago, that we can also capture a signature the way you do on the keypads these days. The more I thought that through though, right, that is dependent on the device that the person has at the home. If they're working on a laptop like this, it doesn't acknowledge my finger on the screen. And if that's their only option, I think we need to maintain an option to do a checkbox style signature. I'm going to work on that a little bit more as we go. So that's the basic process. When you think about it, the reason I said that the pendulum is swinging in terms of providing access to voters with disabilities is that process, the on-screen marking is set up to work with any assistive technology that a person might have at home. So they can do that on-screen marking, for instance, with a sip and puff if they have dexterity issues. Those people with either some kind of dexterity issues, for lack of a better term, voters who are blind or severely limited eyesight, of course, then have trouble with the next step of printing the ballot out, putting that certificate on an envelope, folding the ballot, putting it in the envelope, finding the mailer, addressing it to the clerk and sending it back. That's the rub for the voters with disabilities who really want to be able to conduct this early voting process privately and independently. And that's what those lawsuits have been based around, is that ability to submit the ballot also without showing anybody around you your choices or risking the privacy of your ballot. This would allow for that. As I said, those same assistive devices would allow you to say submit to clerk. The ballot will then come back to the clerk. The clerks all also have a secure login to our system, right? That's where they do all of these election administration functions. And when a clerk logs into our election management system, the first thing they come to is their dashboard, common term, right? And it's got all kinds of daily duties and tasks. It's got their DMV registrations coming over. It's got any online registrations coming in, absentee ballot requests that might have come in for voters for an election. Now there'll be a new category. You've got an electronic ballot returned on the dashboard. Click into that. You might see a little list of voters, 2 or 3 that have returned one this way. Click into that voter, print their ballot out on the clerk's printer. That's the way that it solves the issue for voters with disabilities. In the same way, your military and overseas voters might be on a submarine, might be in all kinds of situations, out in the desert, deployed at the front line, where access to printers is difficult, access to envelopes is difficult, access to postal services is either difficult or non-existent. Talking with my contact at Dem Live recently, he told me that he believes they've had a voter submit a ballot back from the space station through this technology, which is kind of cool, for example. I'm getting close. It's important to note that no less than, I think it's more than the number, I hear different numbers from different sources all the time. I should get the definitive one from the group that I trust the most, but no less than 25 states allow for some form of electronic return. So unlike a lot of election reforms that I bring to you guys at this table over the years, we're actually not at the vanguard of this one at the front. It's a very important, I think, process to adopt and implement, but this is one where we're not at the cutting edge, frankly. It's being done across the country and it's been being done for a long time. The important point is that we've waited for it to get to a place where we know the best, most secure means of doing it, as I've described. I come back to the balance that we stated at the beginning, right? If it's imperative to allow these voters a way to exercise their constitutional right to vote. I hear from at least a handful, if not more, military or overseas voters every election who can't get their ballot back on time because of various circumstances and beg me, why can't I just send you a PDF of the ballot attached to an email? It would be so easy. I think you could hear testimony from clerks. You should bring Carol in. We were talking about it yesterday. She was telling me stories about voters of hers who've asked for this for a long time. I like to say that I try to only come to this committee with significant changes like this to the election process, where I have heard stories from voters where the need is apparent among the voters in Vermont, right? I wanted to liken it to the example of same-day voter registration. Before you could register to vote up to and including election day. It changed a bunch of times, but the most recent one before that was 5 days before the election. And the most difficult calls for me back then, when there was a registration deadline the Wednesday before the election, were calls from otherwise fully qualified voters between that Wednesday and Tuesday and telling them they couldn't register and participate in the election. Clerks would tell me the same thing, of course, hated those conversations. That led to that really common sense reform that solved that problem, eliminated those calls, and it's been a great success since then. This is the voter issue that I hear most about at this point, up to in the days leading up to the election, is how can I get my ballot back on time when I have to mail it, and because of XYZ circumstance, I can't do so. So solving a real need here. We've heard some advocates come to you even this year talking about certain policies that they consider the next logical step in election reform. I won't even address those specifically, but to me, this is the next logical step and most important step in election return that you all can take. I just got back, I was away last week at my National Association of State Election Directors meeting, where nearly all 50 of us get together in a room for 3 or 4 days. This was and has been over the last 2 or 3 years at that meeting, a hot topic of conversation about how states can move to implement this policy and do it in the right way. And frankly, if we can do this, our portal is going to become a model for other states on how to do this in a way that works and is as secure as possible. I think every cybersecurity expert, myself included, although I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I also will tell you, nothing is entirely secure. You're always trying to do the best you can to achieve the highest level of security around anything that involves transmission of information over the internet.
So I think we can take some questions, and then I'd like to have our guest who's waiting online sort of illustrate some of this for us. So let's ask Will some clarifying questions, and then we can come back to Will, because I think you're going to stay for the whole presentation. If that makes sense. Representative Reed first.
Sure, thank you, Will.
Yeah.
One of the questions I've got, I guess, is, there has been an issue with mail recently as far as, getting held up. And I'm just wondering about the internet as well. I mean, for both town clerks that may be receiving it and someone overseas that's sending it. Any discussion around, and again, like I say, there's already an issue with mail, but what about the issue of poor internet or no internet? Last minute, more so than if you did it 2 weeks in advance, you may be good to go. If, you understand that there's a problem, you can get at it again. But if you're doing it a day before or whatever, you may be out of luck. Any discussion around that?
Not directly, but that's a legitimate concern. It's a good thing to think about. I think my immediate reaction is that you don't let the best be the enemy of the good. You do it, you allow it, and you hope that the internet is there to support you in as many circumstances as you can. I think it's more likely that somebody has internet access in 2023 than access to a post office in a lot of these situations. So you try to provide an option that leverages the means of transmission that they're most likely to have access to. And you'll see, it's not directly to your point, but a little bit related, that the language is written that you have to get these back. Right now, it's written you have to get these back to the clerk by the day before the election. I actually was just talking with Carol yesterday that we might want to modify that. There's other places in the bill where we refer to the last day that the clerk's office is open preceding the election, since a significant amount actually have their last day on the Thursday or Friday before. And so if you just say day preceding, you may end up forcing those to come into their office to check on these things, although they can do so online at this point. But the goal of that language is to say that they're not coming in, for instance, on election day when the clerk is at the polls, where there very well may not be internet access. Yeah.
So we are going to have Will, we are going to dig into the language of the bill. So I want to take the questions that folks have. We have a couple hands up, Representative Hango next. But if you have a question for Will that you can save until after we hear our guest testify, I really appreciate that from the committee. But go ahead, Representative Hango.
Thank you. It's just a clarifying question. Did I hear you say that when ballots would be returned theoretically electronically, the clerk then would take the ballot and print it out off from their portal, and then I'm assuming the clerk has access to knowing who sent the ballot and who they're voting for. So how is that private?
It's a good question. It's dealt with in a number of different ways in some of the states I've looked at. Currently, the language in the bill, I've tried to keep it fairly broad, which is just, I think, a smart approach to drafting statute, right? To not get too many details in the statute. The way it says is that it should be printed and treated the same as all other earlier absentee ballots. A little detail or nuance to that. If it were left that way, how the guidance that I would give to the clerks on that process is essentially to mimic the process they use now for the opening of the ballots, which is a two-person process. So I would have the clerk hit print from the system. A separate election official, probably the assistant clerk, would be the one to take it off the printer, fold it, put it in a security envelope. They'll have those, that they send out to the other voters. Seal it. I was just thinking about this morning, which is the same, that one clerk opens the envelope, hands it to another voter after they turn it over to take the ballot out. The assistant clerk puts it in the envelope, then can hand it back to the clerk to actually write the voter's name on the outside of the envelope at that point and the voter ID, and either put it in the bag with the rest of the ballots or process it as they're processing their other.
Thank you.
Some states I know you want to move quickly, Chair McCarthy, and one interesting approach to that I wasn't totally comfortable with, although the committee could consider this language also, is that voters who choose to use that transmission method acknowledge that they give up their privacy in terms of the clerk processing their ballot. And it's amazing, 95% of the people returning these ballots could care less if the clerk sees the votes. But I prefer a method that dictates a modicum of privacy on that end.
I definitely don't mean to rush anyone. I just want to do things in an order where we set up what the heck is the problem we're trying to solve and then really dig into the details about how to solve it. So Representative Hooper, and then we're going to go to our guests. And
It's a mechanics question, so I'll wait until after.
You're okay with that? I appreciate that. I want to try to have the committee trying to tell a story here, a little bit of my theater experience. Representative Lori Houghton, Chair of House Healthcare, had sent me an email a couple of weeks ago that she had a constituent who had an issue voting while they were out of country. And so, Mr. Smith, I appreciate you being with us, joining us remotely today, and I'm very interested to hear about your experience with trying to return a ballot. So thanks for being with our committee.
Thank you for having me. And just a clarifying point, I myself did not experience it. I have twin boys, sons, both of them in the military. One of them is on a rotation where he deploys on a regular basis. He's giving up trying to vote. He tried at the early stages, and then I have my other son is actually a full-time Guard member here in the state of Vermont. Who was just recently deployed during a voting and was unable to vote through the process. I've raised these children to be very involved in their local and state community, as I feel like that's really the most important, especially if you're going to raise a family, that you need to be involved. Give you a basic idea, we've got 2 seats that are going to come up on our city council, and we have 2 people running to fill those seats, which means you don't have any options, which means if those people's views don't align with your views, then you need to be involved in your government. So my family is very involved in paying attention, and their vote is very important to them. And so to give you the story, when my son from the National Guard was deployed just recently, he did get the ballot emailed out to him. And then he has to start the process of trying to get it printed, trying to find 2 different size envelopes, getting it filled out, and then finding a stamp and getting it sent back. The military does not like you to use their electronic equipment. So he got his ballot through his phone. He cannot connect his phone to any of their printers. You cannot just print anything. And he's actually fortunate where he was at a base where all of this stuff was available to him, or was on the premises but not available to him. And he's one of the higher ranking members there, and still cannot just randomly print something without permission. And then to try to find different size envelopes and a stamp to mail stuff was unbelievably complicated. And obviously on deployments, you're only at base for a certain amount of time, and then you're out on mission for a certain amount of time. So as you lengthen this process of first getting permission to try to print something, and then filling it out and then trying to locate or requisition 2 different size envelopes to send this back, it is literally a nightmare and extremely time consuming. And then he's in a different country, and thankfully somebody brought this up. There is a hot topic right now within our community about how they're not receiving mail. It's about every 4th day they're receiving mail because the mail is having such difficulty being delivered at the moment. It seems, I think it's, I want to say in our local election, there's potentially 15 or 30 days potentially that he might be able, from the time that he gets his ballot, to try to get it back. Being overseas, that's nowhere near enough time, especially for a military person, to try to get something printed out, filled out, find envelopes, put it back together, and get it mailed out and complete the mission that you've been sent there to do. There is just not that time. Most of these guys are communicating with their families almost on a daily basis, even in a forward operating base, via their cell phone, through what is going to be the industry standard here. I would think through 2-point authentication. And I'm very encouraged from what I was hearing about how they would be able to sign in. They're not going to be able to print something and send it back in time. So the fact that they would be able to print it and or send it to the clerk and have the clerk print it and run it through the machine. And as he said, 95% of these people are voting anyways, as far as their privacy. I will proudly tell you who I voted for if somebody asked me. So I understand that we're entitled to our privacy, but when it comes to our vote, we just want to have our vote counted, and we don't particularly care who knows. So I beg of you to stay dedicated to this. I think that it does not surprise me that the lawsuits are happening and that they're going to happen. You almost have to put the military, deployed military, in the same means of, they just don't have the access to get that mailed back in the amount of time that they're allotted. I get very passionate about this. My son was very passionate when he was calling. We had several conversations. He was so mad that he wasn't going to be able to get his ballot back. And as I said, my son, who's in the Air Force, has given up even trying. He doesn't even try to vote when he's deployed. And he's within the SOCOM area. He's on a rotation. He's home for 3 to 4 months, and then he's deployed again for 3 to 4 months on a regular basis. So the majority of the times that it comes to vote, he's deployed somewhere in this world. And he's just given up because there's no way he's getting stuff printed out and mailed back and getting it back in time. And that's just not fair. These people are dedicated to our country and our process. They're our first responders. When they're home, these people deserve to have their vote counted. And I just recently had a loan, never saw a person, did it completely online. Everything's completely legal. The amount of things that we can do online, and I get electronic and online is different, right? Once you bring the internet in, there's something a little more serious about that as far as security. But you know, if I can be hacked and have my personal information taken away from me in so many different forms that I'm doing right now, that if it happened in the process of me getting my vote in, it'd be a whole lot easier to swallow. And it'd be a whole lot easier to swallow from my sons. And I am not saying do not take security lightly. I want you to take it as important as it needs to be. But please let my sons vote. I've raised them to be that way. They're going to raise their children to be that way. It would not surprise me if some of my grandchildren end up in the military. Please count their vote.
Mr. Smith, thank you so much for your testimony, for your son's service. really appreciate you joining us and telling their story today. Are there folks who have any clarifying questions or anything they'd like to? I think you told a story that's very compelling and illustrates what we're trying to accomplish with this proposal from the elections division director. And I really appreciate you being here. If you want to stick around as we hear a little bit more about the mechanics of that, if you want to stay in the Zoom room, I'd be happy to have you stay with us. Is there anything else you want to tell the committee before we hear a little bit more about the mechanics of how this works?
Yeah, there was just one more comment so this is my second time testifying. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before that I told this story. And some of the military people were there, and I forget who the gentleman was. But he had talked about that the electronic system was out there. And one of the things that he said that delayed the initiation of this was the military security end of it. And thankfully, it sounds like we're taking the military piece out of the equation with the electronics that I'm hearing is being developed right now. And I fully believe that's what you need to do, because the security, obviously, that the military has to have, especially within a foreign country. So the limit to their equipment is very, very limited. And as I mentioned earlier, these guys are calling home from a forward operating base that doesn't have printers or envelopes or mail at those forward operating bases. They are calling home on their cell phone, and they're able to access the internet from their forward operating bases. So please keep it into the between our state governments and our local governments and our individual voters. And do not try to get to military permission. Not that I'm saying that wouldn't be a good thing if we could do that, but the military is not going to compromise their security in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that we're all carrying mini computers in our pockets, no matter where we go, I think that's the way to go. And I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing. And please stick with it, and please make it happen. And that would be my final comment.
If you're willing, Representative Hooper had a question for you.
Sure.
Thank you for coming and talking with us, Mr. Smith. It's just sort of a simple question. When you talk to your sons who are deployed, how often do you do it eye to eye like we're doing here as opposed to voice to ear?
Boy, I don't.
How often is video available?
I would, for my son in the Air Force, the video seems to be more available than my son when he was deployed. And honestly, my sons also have their own families now. So most of the video conferencing was reserved for their wives and their children, which I can't blame them. Dad generally got a phone call, but I did have several video chats as well. From my son who's in the Air Force. From my son in the military or in the Army, the majority of those conversations were either a phone call or text messaging.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So I really appreciate being here. Mr. Smith, feel free to stick on the Zoom room if you want to see the rest of the testimony on this piece. And also feel free to sign off if you prefer to do that. I am going to say that we should probably take a look at this section of the bill, unless Director Senning, you want to do any more teeing up before we have Tim walk us through. And if you want to stay up and just, we'll have Tim up as well. That might make sense.
Tim doesn't mind, but I will, really quickly, I made it through all of my comments well, but listening to Mr. Smith reminded me of a few additional things. I just want to emphasize, I didn't speak specifically to kind of the timeline, but he is entirely correct to say that the local elections, what we're coming up to right now, present even more difficulty. Under the law, ballots for local elections only have to be ready 20 days before the election. And that's where Mr. Smith was saying they have at most, 20, but more. If I electronically deliver on the 20th day, they've got 20 days to get it back. In the context of the federal elections, Pres primary, August and November, it's back to the 45-day deadline that's driven by the UOCAVA law that I referred to beforehand. I mean, that was sort of the first step at the federal level that they took to try and increase the opportunity for military and overseas voters to return ballots, was this requirement that we have ballots ready 45 days before. That's what in the past got us to move in the primary and everything else. And that's where I think I described to you the other day, if they've got a pending request with us, which most of these folks do because they're on top of it and care as much as Mr. Smith was saying, that's when we blast those ballots out electronically right on that 45th day. And even that, even having the PDF in their hand or the accessible option online on the 45th day, you still are presented with the difficulties he described in getting it back. I wanted to quickly put a pin on it that Mr. Smith again used the term, these are your first responders. In many cases, the military is, right? There are other first responders that go out and are deployed these days to the ever increasing number of natural disasters we have. The former Secretary of State, Secretary Kondos, one of the next steps he wanted to take, and which I'd like the committee to think about, if not this year and years coming, is expanding this subset of voters to first responders that may be deployed to natural disasters, et cetera. Former Secretary Kondos always used to tell a story about when a large contingent of Vermont State Police got deployed to respond to Hurricane Sandy. And it was a couple days, I think, before the November general election that year. And he ended up in conversations with the head of the state police trying to figure out how to get ballots down to these state troopers and return back in time. And in fact, I don't think they were able to. And that always stuck in former Secretary Kondos as another group that maybe have this policy applied to them. And really quickly also, Mr. Smith referred a bunch to the hesitancy to use military technology to accomplish any of this. He couldn't be more correct. That's one of the reasons why it's advanced sort of so slowly. There have been a lot of people over time that have asked the military how the DOD, how we might leverage certain technology they have to do so. And there's been a tension and just a consistent desire not to do so on their part. Really quickly, former Secretary Kondos and I, just to tell you how long I've thought about this and what depth, were part of a subgroup of a Council of State Governments group called the Overseas Voting Initiative. This is one of the pieces of material that we put out 2 or 3 years ago about examining the sustainability of balloting solutions for military and overseas voting. If you look close, you can see me and the former secretary on an aircraft carrier here out in San Diego. But I raise it to say that it was a lot of time spent talking to members of the military who were deployed in various scenarios, describing how difficult it is to get ballots back on time and learning from that experience. And with that, any questions anyone has?
Questions from Representative Hooper and Representative Morgan, and then we'll have Tim come up and walk us through the section.
How many ballots are we talking about here in a general estimate?
I should get you those exact numbers. I should have had them prepared in front of me.
Average per town clerk.
Not over 2,000 statewide.
So it's the mechanics question, and the reason I asked Mr. Smith, how often do you see your actual son? I have a 95-year-old aunt who doesn't see very well anymore. When she gets a bill, she holds it up in front of her Facebook device, and I take a screenshot of it and pay the bill. We might be behind in this, but this system seems pretty convoluted. And when I walk into the polls, the poll worker looks at me and says, "Hi, Bob," and gives me a ballot, and I do stuff with it. If we gave access to the town clerks to have access to the photos in DMV for validity's sake, seems like maybe we're chasing an old dog here. Technology wise, you could have a one-on-one conversation with somebody and they either show you a ballot that they have filled out and the town clerk takes a screenshot of it and processes it, or processes it for the individual just by saying, "I want that guy, I want that lady," depending on how much faith we want to put in our town clerks. But 2,000 ballots seems like a pretty small number for what we're going to pay and the technicality of this. I thought, I defer to you, sir.
Representative Morgan, go ahead.
The thing I was gonna say, it's just a statement, not a question for anybody, is that what we would be up against, the military's got pretty heavy firewalls on their systems, so we'd have to see what the mechanism would be to break through that firewall via the DoD systems, if you would. I think there's gonna be a look that needs to be given to that if this were to be incepted as part of it.
So it sounds to me, and this brings up a question actually for Will, which would be the idea here, if I'm understanding it right, is that while it might be going through the internet connection that is provided on some bases and in some places, what we were talking about with Mr. Smith's example of his sons really was about their own personal device, personally accessing publicly available cellular service that was not part of the secure systems of the military branch in which they were serving. So it gets around that. So it would still require them to have access to some non-secure internet system, whether it was cellular or wired, in order to access this. But if they're accessing the internet for any reason, like if they're able to FaceTime with their family, then they'd be able to do this. Otherwise, they'd have to figure out some way to print a ballot under the current system and mail it back. And it sounds like it's really that printing that's the challenge. Like if you're serving in the Peace Corps in Uganda, or you're a forward operating deployed service person like Mr. Smith's son, the idea that you're going to have access to a printer in time to get that ballot mailed back, that's the thing. But so it's that they would still need to be on a non-secure internet system.
And that wouldn't always be the case, because especially at a forward operating base, a FOB, you would very likely, that's your source of internet. So I'm just throwing it out there for food for thought as a component of it.
So Will, am I right in thinking that the idea isn't necessarily that person who, they're serving in a very secure environment, where they don't have access to publicly available internet. But if you, in that 45-day window before a general election, if at some point during that time, they, they go to some place where they have access to the internet, maybe they wouldn't be able to mail a ballot back in time, but if they have access to the internet, then they can just vote right there. Is that the idea?
Yes. And I would want to even look further. I mean, I defer to the expertise here at the table, but it's just about having internet access. And so if that internet access was being provided somehow by the military, not publicly available in one of these locations, I think it would just be about the policy around use of that internet connection. It may very well be that as long as they can identify themselves as a service member and log in, that then they can use it for this purpose. I don't want to say that I know that option even is foreclosed. The pushback was more against the sort of development, the military hosting the portal, for instance. Use of, and somebody can correct me if I'm referring to it wrong, that CAC card, is it CAC or?
CAT card.
CAT card.
That's your ID. It also has a chip in it that gets you logged into your computer device.
There was some hesitancy, I think, toward having the ballot be returned upon access through the CAT card.
CAC is common access card.
Common access card. But I do think that as long as the policy of whatever internet you're accessing would allow for it, that's the only way that this would touch the military regs.
My question probably better addressed Chase. My recollection from Iraq and a couple of other places is that there's usually a community of video phones set up for.
It was before my time. I was getting muddy in Croatia and Bosnia, not sandy in Iraq and Afghanistan.
It falls into the, it depends on your location again. How
These don't use as much as they use uplink when you're in the field, right?
A cell phone requires a cell tower. None of them are bouncing off any satellites.
It goes from there.
Yeah.
And again, the military could restrict
Yeah.
how much of that can go in and out. That's why.
But at some point in that whole month before the election, if you're able to get into a publicly available internet,
Right.
then you're not sort of having to mail your ballot. It takes weeks to get from wherever you're deployed. Yeah, go ahead, Representative Chase.
One quick point on that, just quickly to put a touch on that, is that if you envision it right, you're getting it electronically delivered. So at some point to access it and see that it's been delivered to you, you need that internet access. You could turn this process around in about 5 minutes. My guess would be that most people do it right then when it's delivered. You know, you're sitting there online, you don't know what's going to happen the next day at the base. So boom, I get it. I make my choices. I hit submit.
Representative Chase.
And they can still request a paper ballot be delivered. And so if you, in a sporadic internet situation, you could request ahead of time to have a paper ballot delivered. So it's kind of,
Yep.
internet access isn't the only option.
Correct. And good point. And I think at this point, back of the envelope, 90% or so request them electronically, but we have a subset of the UOCAVA voters who still like to have the ballot mailed. And have developed a system, I guess, for making sure they get it back.
Well, I'd like to invite Tim to come up and walk through draft 2.7. And if you want to stay in the co-pilot seat, give us context or answer questions, that'd be great. Thanks so much for your work on this, Tim.
Thank you very much, Chair. For the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. And quick question for you, Chair McCarthy. Did you want me to start with the election ballot return language, or did you want me to kind of walk through the entire bill at this point?
Why don't we focus right now on just the new, I think it's section 12.
Yes.
Has this ballot return language, and then we'll take a quick break and go through the other new stuff.
Sounds good. So before you, you have draft 2.7 of the committee bill, number 23-0705. And the pertinent language that we're going to be looking at is at the bottom of page 9. Just for your visual reference, everything that's highlighted has been introduced since you last saw this bill. We walked through it together. One initial note I'd like to make about this, just regarding the section numbers, is I had mistakenly inserted these new sections, probably in the incorrect place. It should probably be a few sections back versus 12. Should be maybe 15 and 16 rather than 12 and 13. Apologies, but just wanted to put that out there before going on. The sections under the part regarding electronic ballot returns are 12 and 13, two sections. Section 12 permits the ballot certificate to be electronically formatted, and Section 13 permits voters who are ill, injured, or have a disability, as well as military and overseas voters, to electronically return ballots via an online portal hosted by the Secretary of State's office, which you've heard about in plenty by now.
So Tim, I want to really be deliberate about exactly what we're talking about, and I know Director Senning did a good job. So just to be totally clear, we're saying this section applies just to those voters who currently are able to get their ballot sent to them electronically, overseas voters, military service people, and Vermont voters with disabilities. And that the portal would be the one set up by the Secretary of State. So it's all controlled by the Secretary of State.
Yes. So turning to the language on the page, Section 12 amends Title 17 VSA, Section 2332. Section 2542, signing certificate. Subsection A reads, there shall be printed on the face of the envelope provided for use in returning early voter absentee ballots, or provided in electronic format if a ballot is electronically delivered pursuant to subsections 2539B or C, a certificate in substantially the following form. And then it's the text of the certification language. Early or absentee voter ballots of blank, print your name, I, blank solemnly swear or affirm that I am a resident of the town, city of blank, state of Vermont, and that I am a legal voter in this town, city. And then a line for the signature. Subsection B reads, the early or absentee voter, except a voter receiving a ballot electronically delivered pursuant to subsections 2539B or C of this title, must sign the certificate on the outside of the envelope in order for the ballot to be valid. When an earlier absentee voter is physically unable to sign the voter's name, the voter may mark an X or take an oath swearing or affirming to the statement on the certificate. The officers who delivered the ballots shall witness the mark or oath and sign their names with a statement attesting to the fact on the envelope. I'll pause there, and I'd just like to also note that the reference to subsections 2539B and C refer to those voting groups that are electronically voting. B is those voters who are injured, ill, or have a disability. Subsection C of that is military and overseas voters.
And just real quick, if I can jump in, this was really the cleanup. Tim actually noticed this certificate language. I was focused on what we'll look at later. And this just says that the same language has to be provided in the electronic format that is put on the envelopes that are mailed to everybody else.
So this is the.
We're already doing it, but it's good to codify it.
Any questions about the section 12 pieces? I think we're good to move on.
Section 13 amends Title 17 VSA Section 2543, which is titled Return of Ballots, specifically subsection D and subdivision 1. Skip down to there. And this is breaks across the bottom of page 10 into 11. D1 has been largely left in to provide context. The actual changes are on D2. Would you like me to skip down, Chair, or read through that?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
We're pretty familiar with
Those under 1 are the current ways you can return a ballot, and this is going to add the new means under 2.
2 reads, beginning on line 10, 2A, all ballots electronically delivered pursuant to subsections 2539B or C of this title and returned as follows shall be counted. I, by means of a secure online portal developed and maintained by the Secretary of State and directly to the clerk before the close of business on the day preceding the election. And I, with electronic signature on the certificate required pursuant to section 2542 of this title prior to submitting ballot to the clerk. B, a ballot electronically delivered pursuant to subsections 2539B or C of this title and then returned pursuant to subdivision 2A of the subdivision shall be printed by the clerk and proceeded in the same manner as all other earlier absentee ballots and in accordance with the procedures prescribed by this subchapter.
Yeah, if I could. So on line 14, when it talks about on the day preceding the election, is this, Will, where maybe you wanted to make some corrections?
That's where we could instead refer to the last day that the clerk's office is open preceding the election. And I think that makes sense.
That seems reasonable to me. So should we go ahead and say for Tim, when we see draft 2.8 or 3.0, that we'll make that change.
Make it be so. It's my experience, the clerk is kind of in email contact with these voters, most typically anyway. And so we'll be saying, get it to me before Thursday when I'm going to be out of the office, but it makes sense to put it in there.
I'm always conscious that if we're making these accessibility changes like we did last biennium, that I want to be, especially in the early stages of making a big change, not putting undue burden on the clerks. So we are expanding this a lot, but I just want to make sure we're mindful of the clerks. Yes, Representative Hango.
Is there a way that if these ballots are going to be sent out electronically to begin with, a disclaimer is put right on that original email that contains the ballot, that they need to be returned by a certain date.
Yes.
Because that would eliminate the clerk then having to remind people or specifically let people know, because it would
Good idea.
already be on there.
If you are going to be returning this electronically, it must be done.
Exactly.
Good suggestion, Representative Hammond. Any other clarifications on this piece before Tim moves on?
It's there.
All right, let's keep going.
Let's see, turning to the top of page 12, this is subdivision D2C. The voter shall be notified when a ballot electronically delivered pursuant to subsections 2539B or C of this title, and then returned pursuant to subdivision A or 2A of this subdivision, is received and printed by the clerk pursuant to subdivision 2B of this subdivision. 3, an early voter absentee ballot returned in a manner other than those set forth in subdivisions 1 or 2A of the subsection shall not be counted.
So C is a lot of cross-referencing. So you're saying the voter has to be notified when their ballot has been returned and printed by the clerk.
Yes.
And that is accomplished through the My Voter page. Would that be enough here? Or is there some other notification that we're talking about?
I read this and put it in there to require kind of another level of direct notification in this instance, rather than just the receive date, which you can see on the page. For the reason of, I just think there's enough, it's for voters like Mr. Smith's sons who are so invested and taken the steps and may be concerned about the internet. Was there a glitch in the access when I hit submit on this? When I hit submit on the button, did it really happen? I suppose just the receipt on my voter page could accomplish that also. But I think having another level of, hey, I got this one that you submitted electronically, it's printed out, you're all set, it's going to be counted with everybody else's ballots. Was my intent there.
So then are you envisioning the clerk or assistant clerk having to compose a separate email to each individual who submits electronically?
Maybe, although you asking that question gives me the thought that we could easily set it up as a system generated email as soon as the clerk gets print.
I think
That
that
it boom sends.
sufficient and easier on the clerks.
Yep, it's a good thought. We do that with a
That
number
was
of.
literally all the pieces I was thinking. I was like, could we email back? And then I was thinking like a form response. So they checked my boxes. Yeah.
Questions about the words on the page for this section or the mechanics of how this might work? I think before we that we will obviously have Carol when she's up for it in the next couple of days give us some feedback on this section. But any other thoughts on this from the committee? Well, I just wanted to ask. So when the clerk prints the ballot in this way, is it the same printing that they're using for the assisted voter system?
Yes.
So there's no real distinction between a ballot that's filled out by someone with a disability that shows up in person versus someone who returns their ballot electronically this way, in terms of like the ballot's printed the same way, it appears the same.
No, and thanks for asking, because that's actually a unique part of our system that's really nice, is that what prints out looks and feels exactly like all other ballots, except that probably the ovals are marked much more cleanly than
Yes.
But because you asked and brought that up, I wanted to say these printers actually that we've developed with the system, I think I'd said this before, can actually print on the tabulator readable stock and make it so that these ballots don't have to be transferred. And so what we'll do is order a small amount of stock for each of the clerks to have for the early voting and for the polling place for ballots that come off, so that they can be directly taken off the printer and into the tabulator if that's the case.
Great. So I would like to give the committee a short break before we go into the whole bill. So let's say that we're doing a 10-minute break with a couple minutes to spare. So we will be starting at 11:20 sharp.